All right, let's dive into this stack of source material you've shared with us. This deep dive is custom tailored just for you, pulling out the essential knowledge, those surprising facts, and, the crucial context about Suriname. Think of us as your guides, helping you navigate this rich collection of information from its ancient past right up to the challenges of today.
Exactly. What's remarkable about this material is how it provides a really comprehensive picture, touching on so many different aspects: history, culture, economy, environment, and international relations. It gives us a deep well to draw from.
So let's start where your sources begin. The land itself, long before European ships appeared. We learn that human presence here stretches back, way back.
That's right. The archaeological evidence presented in your sources indicates people were in this region at least 7,000 years ago. Initially, these were foraging and fishing tribes, moving and migrating primarily along the rivers.
But they weren't static. The sources reveal that by around 500 AD, we see signs of, well, more complex societies emerging. This isn't just simple foraging anymore. We're talking stone objects, pottery, even earthen mounds used for rituals or maybe burials.
It suggests a shift towards more settled, village-based life, particularly in the coastal floodplains and savanna areas. Then, as we get closer to the arrival of Europeans, the key groups documented are the Arawak and Carib peoples.
And the sources note something interesting about them. They were relatively recent arrivals themselves, coming from the Amazon basin less than 1,000 years before the Europeans did.
Yeah, a significant migration just prior to another major arrival. Your sources describe the Arawak people living in riverside settlements, practicing agriculture, fishing, and hunting. They used a horticultural method of cultivation, building semi-permanent wooden houses with round, open spaces. Some Arawak clans settled permanently along rivers to gather specific products needed by their more mobile relatives.
The Caribs, though, your sources paint a more aggressive picture of their arrival.
They do. Setting off from the Orinoco banks, the Caribs used war canoes to invade Arawak territory in the late 15th century. The sources are specific. Their raids targeted Arawak women, while the men were often taken captive, either ritually killed or enslaved. This conflict pushed the Arawaks towards the swampier areas, with the Caribs taking over the valuable farming land.
So a period of intense violence and displacement. But here's a surprising nugget from your material. Despite this initial conflict, the sources describe a shift.
What's particularly fascinating here is the subsequent development of intermarriages and alliances between the Caribs and Arawaks, leading to the formation of composite villages. The sources note this resulted in a peaceable level, which is quite a turn given the violent beginning.
Peaceable, yes, but the sources also highlight the Caribs' dominance at the time Europeans arrived. They claimed the larger part of the territory and, notably, had monopolized the slave trade, even conducting raids on Portuguese settlements along the Brazilian coast.
And their approach to the arriving Europeans differed. The sources contrast the Caribs, who adopted a defensive strategy and generally distrusted the newcomers, with the Arawaks, who were more willing to negotiate.
This sets the stage for the next wave of arrivals. Your sources mention that the area wasn't unknown to navigators before 1492, but early European explorations were more about searching for riches elsewhere.
Right. Figures like Amerigo Vespucci and Vicente Pinzon were in the vicinity around the turn of the 16th century, but their focus was elsewhere, towards the Amazon or Orinoco mouths, searching for gold. The Spanish initially called the area Marana or Parime rivers, names that eventually contributed to Guyana.
So, visits in the 16th century by Spanish and Dutch along the coast and major rivers. But the European perception, according to your sources, was, well, a bit dismissive of the land itself.
Precisely. The sources note that despite seeing the richness in flora and fauna and the presence of diverse tribes, the potential for developing agriculture in these rich, huge fields was largely ignored or disparaged, compared to the glittering fantasies of silver and gold found elsewhere in the Americas.
There were small early attempts at settlement, a French one in 1562. Portuguese and French sugar planters sent and recalled. These didn't stick.
Which brings us to the growing Dutch interest, particularly in sugar. Your sources mention they even plundered Portuguese ships returning from Brazil, indicating their focus.
The Dutch really started establishing a foothold around 1624 in the Suriname River area. A key action mentioned in your sources is their requisitioning of land from the native peoples.
Yes, laying claim to territory already inhabited. An officer, Johannes de la Montagne, identified the area as well suited for sugarcane, which began drawing more planters. Then, a significant event in 1630, during the European 12 Years' Truce, that temporary pause in conflicts, mainly between Spain and the Dutch Republic, the Dutch captured the territory from the Spanish.
There was an early Dutch settlement and military presence, but the sources highlight that post-truce developments saw the Dutch holding Suriname and appointing a governor.
And they actively encouraged planters from Brazil to settle, crucially including exiled Portuguese settlers who brought with them valuable knowledge of tropical agriculture, cotton, sugar, and significantly, African slaves.
By 1645, your sources indicate a linguistic mix emerging. Portuguese, Dutch, and English were being used. Agriculture was flourishing, and the profitability of sugar was a major driver.
The English were also players, particularly planters like Lord Willoughby de Eresby.
Huh.
The sources mention resistance from both Portuguese and Amerindians, and even failed Dutch attempts to capture Suriname in 1667.
So the Dutch West India Company decided warfare was too expensive, allowing the English colonists more autonomy. This set the stage for a remarkable exchange.
One of the most famous historical swaps, detailed in your sources. The negotiated peace in 1667, confirmed by the Treaty of Breda later that year, which ended the Second Anglo-Dutch War, saw the English trade their claim on New Amsterdam, which is modern-day New York, for the Dutch capture and control of Suriname.
New York for Suriname, quite a swap. It's a stark illustration of the perceived value of Caribbean colonies compared to North American ones at the time. Lord Willoughby was put in charge for the English, dividing land into 6 properties, and your sources say the Spanish-style houses from this period still stand.
A lasting architectural legacy. But the Dutch still held a fort that restricted river development, and the territories remained administratively distinct. English planters, spurred by Willoughby, sought to remove these bureaucratic hurdles.
The English interregnum mentioned here refers to that period after the English Civil War when England was ruled without a monarch. With the Dutch victory in the 1667 war, the treaty cemented the trade. The colony was formally introduced to the British, and a new organization was set up.
Yes, and the key Western Sugar region was sold to a newly formed entity, the Society of Suriname, for development. The colony was reestablished under Sir John Yeamans, expanding existing posts and building new forts. The neglected colony was handed to the Society of Suriname.
The Dutch continued recruiting Brazilian planters and using a system of payment in kind. The sources mention a curious detail about independence of bricks being necessary, perhaps highlighting a lack of fundamental building materials. Victualling ships were apparently crucial for establishing the economy.
All of this points to the rapidly developing plantation system, and with that growth came a critical demand for labor. Your sources explicitly connect the failure to utilize indigenous peoples on a large scale to the introduction of African slavery around 1650.
That's a foundational point. Initially, the sources indicate enslaved people from Angola, specifically the Kwanza River area, were the primary labor force.
But from 1660 onwards, the material clearly shows a shift, with the majority imported from the Gold Coast, modern Ghana.
And the sources note that the export of enslaved people from West Africa to Suriname temporarily ceased in 1863, the year of abolition. During this period, Suriname rose to become a major center for sugar production in the Caribbean.
This scale of production required huge capital investment and larger operations, which your sources say posed significant challenges for the Dutch. The Dutch West India Company even took actions described as manipulating geography, trying to limit rival claims from Spanish and Portuguese Brazil.
And this development was impacted by conflict, including the First Dutch War, which, according to this material, seems to refer to a prolonged period of conflict extending until 1781.
A backdrop of conflict throughout this critical development phase. The sources are quite direct about why enslaved labor was deemed necessary. White laborers struggled in the unforgiving equatorial jungle environment. This challenge was exacerbated by the new colonial rulers not simply taking over the existing Portuguese governmental structures, which might have provided more established systems.
Your sources characterize the resulting system as a more brutal brand of slavery.
A harsh assessment, directly from the material. The sources also add that enslaved people from Angola brought knowledge of palm oil production. By the late 17th century, Suriname sugar was firmly integrated into the Atlantic market.
The very first black people in Dutch Suriname were actually former enslaved people of the Portuguese who changed allegiance after a political event called the Lisbon coup, but their numbers were small initially.
Right. So by 1663, after a Portuguese counteroffensive, the Dutch needed more laborers. They implemented what the sources call a proactive policy, trying various methods, recruiting merchant mariners, using trading companies, even attempting labor renting, although that failed due to differences in work structure and ethnic composition.
And they considered indigenous peoples for importation too, even having some limited success. But it failed on a large scale as indigenous groups fled further into the hinterland.
The sources describe a pattern where populated coastal regions experienced a drying up soil tendency, leading to people being pushed or expelled into the empty hinterland. The plantation economy saw distinct phases, including one described with Capuchins transferring Amerindians to central places, alongside what the sources controversially phrase as an insane increase of imported African carnivals in the broad hinterland.
That phrase, insane increase of imported African carnivals, is certainly striking language used by the source, perhaps reflecting a bewildered or prejudiced view by the author of the influx of different African groups and their traditions.
It highlights the challenge of interpreting historical sources, doesn't it? The early plantation sector is described as small-scale, often with 15-20 enslaved laborers, where white migrants worked cooperatively to exploit labor.
Yeah.
The sources note that as this transition from white to black labor occurred, slavery came to be seen as indispensable for the sugar economy.
Your sources delve into how the transport of enslaved people was facilitated, essentially bought, by presenting a lucrative trade to inhabitants along the Guyana coast. There's a very difficult passage here. The respected Creole slave is contrasted with those caught in war on the African coast, whose purchase price was ridiculous. And then the source includes the line, "A white man was always a breed better."
These are stark and deeply disturbing lines from the sources, reflecting the inherent racism and brutality embedded in the system. The material acknowledges that slavery wasn't a uniform experience and certainly wasn't unproblematic. Enslaved people were branded. The sources mention incredulous white men viewing Christian slaves or Negroes with suspicion, describing them as demonic witch stories.
And there are protests, like against the banning of mint or shackling, sometimes originating from groups within the enslaved population described as more representative Dutch West African society groups.
Yet the sources also note that cooperation existed out of mutual interest in some cases. Some enslaved individuals rose to positions of influence, described as becoming warlords, and individuals of mixed European and African descent, referred to as mulattoes in the source, were sometimes established in white towns. There were conflicts over the legal status of children born from intermarriages. The source contains another challenging phrase here: worst of the white, and therefore slaves had the most respectable prospects.
That's another difficult phrase to process, suggesting a complex and perhaps cynical view within the source material about social mobility or prospects within this oppressive hierarchy. But over time, traditional communities did form on interior riverbanks.
Yes, referred to as palanquins in the source. And resistance, sometimes rooted in religious ceremonies, arose. The Maroon villages, formed by formerly enslaved people who escaped to the interior, are mentioned, their exact date of origin linked in the sources to linguistic separation between different groups.
And the Creole slave population wasn't passive. The sources state they gradually gained rights and immigration eased the harshest conditions. Eventually, a free community was bred.
This highlights the agency and resilience of enslaved populations in carving out spaces of freedom and identity, even within the brutal confines of slavery, as documented in your sources.
Now, while Europeans were establishing their presence and the system of slavery, your sources are very clear about the catastrophic impact this had on the indigenous populations already living on the land.
Absolutely. The primary and devastating impact, as described in the material, was the introduction of new diseases. Indigenous peoples had no immunity, leading to widespread decimation.
And beyond disease, the sources mention enslavement and explicit attempts by colonists to exterminate indigenous groups in their relentless pursuit of land.
Your sources list 6 indigenous peoples present when the Dutch arrived in 1602. The Arawaks, Caripuna, Arawaks, Waro, Trio, and Akawayo.
How did the Dutch newcomers perceive these groups?
The material describes the indigenous societies as a perplexing mystery to the Dutch, who found it hard to understand their complex social structures. Shockingly, the sources state that the mission of the first Dutch settlers in 1603 was explicitly genocide against these groups, initiating a campaign of terror.
A very direct and disturbing account from your sources. And the consequences were immediate and severe.
Massacre or enslavement. This led to the depopulation of many areas within decades. By 1667, the company had lost effective control of the economy and was in a state of war with the indigenous peoples of the interior.
And here's a crucial point from your sources. The interior was never fully conquered by the Europeans. It remained a largely autonomous region, described as operating like a Wild West for a considerable period.
Initially, indigenous retreat to the interior was a matter of survival. Your sources note that the idea of peaceful coexistence persisted even after Suriname gained independence in 1975, despite the declining numbers of indigenous groups.
While progress has been made since independence, the sources describe it as a bittersweet pill, stating that the position, legal rights, and presence of indigenous peoples in Suriname cannot be favorably compared to countries like Brazil, Venezuela, or the USA.
The Civil War of the mid-1980s had a particularly brutal impact on the interior, leading to massive violence, lawlessness, and the terrorization and depopulation of many indigenous communities.
However, within this period of devastation, your sources highlight a paradoxical positive development. The Civil War actually spurred the founding of indigenous peoples' organizations, which in turn rekindled the dream of nation building.
Significant lawful progress has been made since then, but the sources emphasize that challenges remain in ensuring local development, securing customary land rights, especially amidst ongoing gold rushes, gaining full recognition of cultural identity, and ensuring their participation in politics and dialogue that acknowledges their distinct worldviews.
Let's shift gears to another pivotal moment documented in your sources, the abolition of slavery. This didn't happen easily or smoothly.
Far from it. The material describes colonists acting discreetly, even underhandedly. There are mentions of surprising twists after abolition laws were passed, including hastily drafted legislation that would have ended the system if it had been properly enforced.
Efforts were made to prevent escape, but the sources note these often worsened conditions. And the resistance efforts by enslaved people themselves against abolition campaigns appear to have been largely forgotten in the official narratives described.
Laws prohibiting the importation of enslaved people were widely ignored, leading to increased smuggling. Customs officers attempted to mark ships, but a new arrangement removed the duty, allowing smuggling vessels to pass inspection.
The situation became so intense for residents, according to your sources, that in 1835, colonists themselves requested a proclamation against importation due to the blatant disregard for the law. Yet the matter was referred back to an old company charter that, the sources say, effectively kept the business going.
The sources describe a curious scramble between importers and a perceived leniency at the Office of Navigation. There was a growing notion that slavery had outlived its usefulness, partly driven by complaints that labor was cheaper elsewhere.
An amended decree aimed at punishing collaborators in clandestine importation, described as treating them like greatest guilty persons, worried colonists. The sources include a vivid detail about the difficulty of collecting required funds amidst a public hearing and a wild scene of rescue that was unsuccessful.
This depicts a system under immense pressure. The sources place this within the broader early 19th century context where various countries were moving towards abolition. In the Netherlands, the topic was dormant after the French era, especially given the powerful slaveholding estates.
It took external pressure, specifically from the British in 1831, for the Dutch government to commission an inquiry into the status of enslaved people and the economy. Critically, the findings of this commission were against abolition.
This led to defensiveness among Suriname residents who expected the government to accept the findings and even prepared a protest. The Commission's report is described as containing an anachronistic measure designed to turn citizens against slavery, suggesting the legislators crafting it didn't fully understand conditions in Suriname and based their proposals on theory rather than reality on the ground.
Adherence to the system was apparently shaken by a cholera outbreak. Slave owners anticipated an onslaught from Suriname, with a mention of an attack by someone named Van Vollenhoven. The sources also reference Jamaica's tumultuous experience with returning formerly freed Negroes to a form of apprenticeship, suggesting a precedent being considered.
In Suriname, there was a recognized need for legislative action before further disturbances, but local legislators lacked the authority to accept the proposed regulations, despite previous instructions.
The sources describe the eventual liquidation of slavery as a monumental upheaval and reform. The fragile peace achieved in 1863 is described as won back by Black people, who notably later suppressed revolts themselves with force. The process involved repression, reformation, and restructuring simultaneously.
Following emancipation, former slaves often gathered in villages. Plantations continued operating, selling products, but changes by planters impacted the lives in these plantation villages. A wage system was introduced, restructuring the economy. Some estates were even reconfigured into plantation villages using confiscated or virtually confiscated land.
The assumption by the ruling class was that the formerly enslaved Black laborers would continue working voluntarily on the plantations.
But your sources highlight a different reality. On September 1, 1863, the free Black people primarily sought land in the interior bush and their own independence. The language here is quite powerful. The living circumstances were, under the conditions of slavery, very good, but like the death of a mother, no longer could they rest content in the bosom of it, with the actual vision of the possibilities of the future.
That striking passage emphasizes that even if conditions were relatively good within slavery, the vision of actual freedom and independence was an irresistible force, according to the sources.
It puts the motivation for seeking independence into sharp focus. Pre- and post-abolition opposition initially mirrored each other, focused on legislative details regarding privileges. Efforts were certainly made to maintain the core plantation society structure.
However, the sources note a gradual decline of this old order after 1873, explaining it by added powers of repression that ironically turned against the elite itself.
After 1870, disgruntled planters, merchants, and sailors sought new forms of opposition. The capitalist class, fearing revolt, became quite effective in staging stampedes on budgetary abuses, which by the end of 1875, according to the sources, led to the downfall of the administration, including key figures like the king's representative and white merchants.
With the loss of the supply of enslaved African labor, your sources detail the critical search for new alternative labor.
A major turning point. The decision was made to investigate using people from India as a substitute source of labor, assessing their numbers and skills. This led to the system of indentured laborers brought under 5-year agricultural contracts.
There were many difficulties in this transition, but over time, these laborers became more integrated into Surinamese society. Your sources highlight that these social and cultural contrasts introduced during this period significantly shaped contemporary Suriname.
Connecting the arrival of Indian indentured laborers and the ongoing development of Creole culture to international developments that had begun a century earlier with the slave trade.
Moving into the 20th century, your sources describe the path towards self-governance. The groundwork was laid in 1936, but full implementation was delayed until 1944, notably due to the Second World War.
That's right. The first government chosen through a general election took office in 1944. Some progress was made in economic and social structures, but the war itself didn't bring the fundamental long-term changes that might have been hoped for.
And the sources attribute this lack of long-term change primarily to two factors.
First, Holland's significantly weakened position after the war, particularly the loss of colonial revenues from places like the East Indies, which diminished its ability to support Suriname in developing its own robust structures. Second, a severe lack of experienced local personnel created a vacuum in top administrative and governmental roles.
There were attempts to fill these positions with knowledgeable people, both from within Suriname and abroad. But the sources describe the post-war years as unfortunate, leading to increased polarization between haves and have-nots.
The pre-war economy faced challenges, but agriculture saw some gains. Drainage improvements helped increase production, rice exports improved after land compaction, and Suriname even managed to replace Jamaica as a supplier on the European beans market.
However, the small wood sector suffered from underpricing and being outcompeted. Post-war production increases couldn't keep pace with rising prices.
Sugar mills, previously focused on a single crop, used profits accumulated during the war to diversify into areas like electricity generation and canned fruits, including mangoes. Efforts were made in copper and gold exploration, but these didn't result in immediate production, and the mineral industry's overall contribution wasn't dramatically different from pre-war levels initially.
A key point from your sources is that the complete absence of foreign capital investment in the initial post-war period delayed the development of a more diversified economy. The administration seemed to expect that the country's physical geography would naturally lead to industrial centers.
Interest in development cooperation emerged later, in the late 1950s. The plans weren't designed to create dependency, but rather stemmed from Dutch institutions feeling somewhat overshadowed compared to U.S. interests in the region.
This cooperation did grow, described in your sources as a moth-like mutual dependence, facilitated by peaceful relations and inexpensive co-financing. The sources also mention what they call foreign interference in local affairs, actions that seemed independent of the proposals made by development service bodies.
Your sources also provide a detailed look at Suriname's strategic importance during WWII itself. The conflict was framed around preserving liberty. But the post-victory world brought new geopolitical challenges like the rise of totalitarian states.
Britain, France, and the other victors felt a need to safeguard the world against Germany, Japan, and the emerging power of Russia. Holland, as a colonial power, was expected to take measures in its territories.
With Britain lacking a large army in Europe and the Dutch East and West Indies seen as threatened by Japan and Germany, Holland was expected to take military measures, both offensive and defensive. The U.S. involvement after Pearl Harbor intensified this.
The Dutch islands, specifically Curacao, are highlighted in your sources as crucial sea junctions connecting the Pacific and Atlantic lying on vital routes. German control, the sources state, would have stopped world traffic and delivered a major blow to Allied supply lines.
The sources even include a reference to General de Gaulle, who apparently saw the potential loss of these territories as a major triumph for the Axis. The attitude of the colonies towards their own future also became important during this period. Preserving these colonies for the Allied war effort gained greater significance compared to earlier conflicts.
U.S. and British warships were present in the Netherlands West Indies by late 1940. Curacao's defenses are described as poor, with inadequate batteries, and even $1 million from Washington wasn't seen as enough to prepare against a Japanese attack.
Communications were also targeted. There was no radio contact with the West Indies from March 1942, with ocean waters apparently crossed deliberately to cut communication lines. To ease ascending agitation among the population, the new governor signed the Dutch Constitution on July 1, 1942.
The defense of Dutch Guiana, or Suriname, was formally entrusted to the British in 1942 under the looming threat of Japanese attack. By 1943, a British brigadier general arrived in Paramaribo and effectively took executive power. While the Dutch formally remained in place, they were subordinate.
The sources note that almost all civil servants were discharged, including the governor and judiciary. Doctors were hired locally from Paramaribo, and Surinamese individuals were appointed to key administrative roles like Administrator of Public Health.
In 1944, a civil committee composed of Surinamese was established specifically to collect and summarize complaints against the British administration. New schools were opened, and a workers' union was founded during this period.
When the Dutch returned in 1945, considering the security period over, they largely reverted to the old situation. However, the war had left some lasting changes.
The Postal and Telegraph Service, the PTT, was reorganized. British Public Works left a legacy of intensified road, street, and building construction. An electricity company was founded.
Interestingly, when the British left, they tore out telephone and telegraph wires and placed new stations in the interior for a separate PTT service there. British influence also led to a minimum wage for teachers and their inclusion in civil servant insurance and old age pensions.
Medical facilities saw improvement too, with a first-class clinic established in Paramaribo, along with supply stations for specific diseases and anti-tuberculosis training through free clinics run by the PTT.
Investments continued and even increased post-war. There's a mention of purchasing a TUM 90 with capital. Textbooks were outsourced, and the colony started issuing its own weekly publication.
However, dissatisfaction arose with the arrival of new civil servants from the Netherlands who are willing to work for lower salaries. The ban on ivory imports into the Netherlands also removed a significant income source for Surinamese, according to the sources.
All these historical developments set the stage for the push towards independence. Your sources describe a gradual evolution of political institutions and the emergence of a new political elite.
This elite initially included traditional planters and new business people of Indo-Surinamese and Chinese descent, forming a political system that the sources call incompletely representative.
From the 1930s onwards, political activists from different ethnic groups began forming more radical parties focused on achieving independence. The first leaders were often from left-oriented Labour Party backgrounds.
Your sources mention key figures like Mr. E. Dahl and Mr. E. F. de Waal, who founded an independence organization in 1954 that became a political party in 1955. They actively organized meetings for different ethnic groups, including in the interior, to discuss the purpose and necessity of independence.
A major focus for these groups was influencing younger leaders and helping them access higher education. In 1963, a National Assembly, open to all ethnic groups, was elected to participate in parliamentary discussions about the future.
While full independence wasn't immediately achieved, these political activities opened up a wider horizon for Surinamese society. In 1965, a central committee wrote to Queen Juliana to appoint a representative to discuss what they termed the Surinamese question.
Efforts were made to unify with a related organization founded in the Netherlands. Negotiations led to unity and the establishment of university statutes. The organization joined this federation in 1966.
A university was founded in the Netherlands in 1966, with scholarships provided by the Surinamese government, enabling more students to pursue higher education. The post-WWII era brought increased urgency for decolonization across Dutch territories.
Organized political activism in Suriname truly took off with the formation of the Suriname People's Party, SPP, on December 24, 1948. This party gained a broad following, holding rallies in both urban and rural areas.
The government responded by enacting a political ban, punishable by imprisonment or fines. However, an amnesty granted before states' general elections provided an opportunity for renewed activity. The SPP successfully mobilized supporters on Republican and anti-racist platforms to win seats, replacing the pre-war established figures, a success repeated in subsequent elections.
Within Suriname, the results were mixed, leading to a sordid coalition political scene, as described in your sources. The SPP also faced challenges, including net losses due to a ban on using the Suriname language for party activities.
In 1954, the SPP changed its name to the National Party of Suriname, NPS, rebranding itself as a People's Party with stated multi-ethnic ambitions.
They held an impressive multi-ethnic meeting in September 1954, which includes the poet Albert Hellman. However, confusion arose regarding how to assimilate immigrants into this multi-ethnic vision.
There was also confusion over party leadership. An interim committee was formed, but your sources describe an internal coup where P.A. Bijibroki Miskin became party chair, a move associated with threats of violence by paramilitary Creole youth.
The Dutch initially dismissed this as a minor event, a storm in a teacup, but your sources state it signaled a tidal wave of change to come. The democratic elections that followed, like the one in May 1958 where the NPS defeated a large multi-ethnic alliance, revealed underlying anxieties among the electorate. Fears of a Creole takeover, fueled by the NPS coup, concerned Dutch politicians.
Limited political autonomy was granted incrementally in 1954, refined in 1957, and cemented in 1963. Opposition to the ruling party, led by Johan Ferrier, also emerged, forming into two larger movements.
An opposition coalition won local elections in 1963. Later that year, a broader-based University of Suriname opened, contributing to a steady increase in the number of trained professionals within the country.
In 1969, the government announced its intention to draft a new constitution leading to independence within a decade, a time frame agreed upon in 1971. A coalition government subsequently prepared this constitution, which was approved by referendum in 1975.
During this independence campaign, led by Henk Aaron's party, there was a significant mass migration of primarily Dutch settlers to the Netherlands. Your sources add that it took over 40 years for many of these individuals to fully establish themselves as Surinamers in their new home.
The Executive Council for Independent Suriname was sworn in on November 25, 1975. Johan Ferrier became the first president, and Henk Aaron the prime minister and head of government.
Your sources mention that there was strong interest in independence among many Dutch Surinamese, both within organized political groups and the wider population, although less interest among the Dutch elite in the Netherlands. Post-independence, there was a significant shift in economic power towards Surinamese leaders.
However, Aaron's government retreated from promises of sweeping government ownership made during the campaign. They attempted to curb mass immigration, even calling it a betrayal, while at the same time accepting that control of new companies would be lost.
A critical assessment from your sources is that the government destroyed integrated companies on both sides during this process, rapidly harming the economy. This is contrasted with the experiences of some earlier Caribbean nations. The ongoing migration played a role, with your sources stating it halved Suriname's GDP per capita by 1980.
The early years after independence were indeed turbulent, marked by political indecision, economic decline, and social division. Your sources detail significant turmoil in the post-independence era.
Yes, the political history since 1975 is characterized by a series of military coups, periods of military rule, civil wars, and eventual returns to democratic governance. The first president, Johan Ferrier, was overthrown in a coup led by Lieutenant Colonel Desi Bouterse, the head of the National Army.
After a failed attempt to reinstate Ferrier, Bouterse established the National Military Council as the supreme authority. Opponents faced severe consequences, including exile, imprisonment, or murder, as documented in your sources.
Increasing unrest and opposition led to a pro-democracy uprising by paramilitary groups in the northern interior. This escalated into the Surinamese Interior War, which lasted from 1986 to 1992.
The Civil War concluded with a peace accord, leading to the formation of a new multi-party government headed by a former paramilitary leader, Ronald Venetian. However, your sources note that Bouterse's power base remained largely intact despite the return to civilian rule.
Further turmoil followed. New revelations emerged in 1999 regarding Bouterse's alleged role in the December murders of opposition leaders in 1982.
And then another military coup occurred in 2010, followed by renewed civil unrest that ended in August 2011. Economically, the country suffered significantly, with the economy contracting for 5 years during the Civil War and foreign debt increasing.
An ambitious plan was launched to restore growth, promote agriculture, and attract foreign investment. While some success was seen, particularly in mineral extraction, these efforts were, according to your sources, hindered by endemic corruption, mismanagement, and instability.
In the new millennium, there were large budgets and loans, often conditional on structural reform policies. The economy did grow for a period, but an expansionary monetary policy where the money supplies increased strained the country's capabilities. These domestic issues were compounded by worsening external economic conditions.
Your sources describe the political landscape as intricate, characterized by numerous parties, often short-lived and prone to internal divisions, leading to constantly shifting alliances. While an informal, multi-party consensus historically operated under both authoritarian and democratic regimes, factionalism frequently erupted into violent confrontations.
The 1980 military coup abolished parliamentary democracy. A supreme military council took control, initially supported by a revolutionary front of civilian parties and groups that were, at the time, in disarray.
In 1988, elections were held under military oversight, leading to a new parliament and a presidential election where Bouterse was nominated. As president, his stated domestic priorities were stability and forging a long-term common interest in parliament, while internationally, he aimed to strengthen ties with specific countries.
However, your sources state that merging party interests proved illusionary, leading to ongoing discontent, criticism of a lack of clarity, and complaints about job promotion prospects for public servants. The government faced what's termed a constituent revolt. Sections of the population became alienated from the parliamentary system.
Attempts by the government to restore order escalated into what your sources call a full war against all opposition. Organized opponents were often forced into exile, leading isolated existences in neighboring regions.
Dissent against Bouterse grew due to his failure to deliver on promises. The security services response was inconsistent, described as caught in confusion, with some officers even defecting. This gradual erosion of support, according to your sources, was a turning point that led Bouterse to adopt a more severe stance.
The implications of this became clear in the spring of 1991, when government forces retaliated with troops, resulting in far more violent consequences, as noted in the material.
The military's access to foreign revenue was cut off due to the Bouterse regime's inability to account for disputed funds. Bouterse also faced mass resignations from ministerial and senior official positions, which added to the confusion within the military leadership.
On May 1, 1991, Bouterse and the FAL, his military force, fled to France, with Bouterse eventually settling in the Netherlands.
A key outcome of the subsequent elections was a civil pact between the parties, which included a significant agreement. Bouterse and his associates would not be prosecuted for offenses committed before 1991. Your sources contrast this with other cases, noting that individuals involved in a narcotics shipment at Bilmer Airport in 1998 also received immunity, but someone who killed a convict in the Termer case in 1999 did not.
This created a complex situation, which the source argues gave the impression that politics was solely about managing the consequences of crime. The debate around a death penalty moratorium was seen by some as outrageous, given the numerous unsolved cases mentioned.
Your sources paint a stark economic picture in the post-turmoil period. Despite having natural resources, Suriname was unable to capitalize on the opportunity for development. Unemployment, inflation, and foreign debt increased.
Critically, your sources state that the economy collapsed completely in 1982, and as of the publication date of this material in 2017, had not recovered since.
Prior to independence in 1975, the economy was described as relatively well-functioning, largely due to foreign investment in the bauxite industry. The anticipation of independence raised local expectations, but also led to a decline in oversight and controls.
Investments were delayed, and the first signs of economic crisis appeared. The civil service struggled to adapt and experienced a downturn. The economy under the first president was fragile.
An attempt to nationalize the bauxite industry, described as a failed coup d'etat in 1980, led to economic collapse. The military took command but could not control inflation or unemployment. They seized assets to deal with social unrest.
By 1982, state companies held gold and foreign currency, which they attempted to use to improve the economy. However, by the mid-90s, the economy was at a standstill and inflation was rising. Authorities wanted to increase taxes, but, according to the sources, poor administration prevented this.
The sources reiterate that the economy collapsed again 10 years after the coup, referring to the 1990s. The state lost control of its finances in early 1982. The population doubled in 10 years, but the government failed to hire enough civil servants to serve the new inhabitants.
Government budget cuts led to soaring inflation, hitting 300% by 1983. Between 1982 and 1986, the situation worsened from a general recession to a deep depression, with all state companies going bankrupt. Suriname was forced to request external help in 1984.
In 1986, presidential and legislative elections allowed previously outlawed parties to participate, forming a political coalition. The new government accepted recommendations for an economic stabilization plan, which included putting state companies up for auction and implementing austerity measures.
Hostility to these policies grew, requiring riot control measures. Your sources describe the economy becoming completely unproductive due to stripping capital through heavy taxes and strict partitioning of foreign currency.
The idea, prior to independence, that Suriname could achieve functional development without aid is dismissed in your sources as a fantasy, given the lack of basic infrastructure like roads, harbors, medical care, education, and skilled personnel. Massive outside aid was deemed necessary.
The fundamental question presented in the sources is whether the economy was robust enough to gradually reduce its reliance on the Netherlands. The starting configuration around independence was viewed as negative.
Contemporary Suriname's economy is compared to southern South America, with agriculture and mining playing historical roles. The idea of conditional development aid emerged, viewing land as a multi-purpose resource.
Your sources highlight that incorporating state lands as basic resources in 1975 was intended to allow Surinamese to benefit more directly. However, the sources describe it as an absurdity that land was often transferred via concession agreements for almost for nothing by the government.
Switching gears now to Suriname's cultural landscape, your sources describe a remarkable heritage and ethnic diversity, especially given its relatively small population.
It's a country where, even in cities, settlements and neighborhoods are often centered around specific ethnic groups, and many people continue to live in villages. The languages and literature reflect this rich mix, with some cultural traditions dating back centuries. Your sources mention 4 categories of local literature.
The ethnic groups listed include Amerindians, descendants of enslaved Africans known as Maroons, East Indians, Javanese, Creole people, Chinese, white Europeans, and foreign workers. Suriname-born individuals are often identified by an extended ethnic group name in their surname, like Schranengroes or Hindustan.
The Amerindians are the original inhabitants. Other groups arrived as imported laborers, many of whom were allowed to remain, retaining their languages and cultures. The languages used include Dutch, colloquial or Creole Dutch, and various native languages. Dutch is the official language used in schools, courts, and government, and Suriname is the only country outside the Netherlands where it holds this status.
Interestingly, your sources note an apparent absence of significant social division based on religion. Hindus maintain their traditions, and mosques and temples are well maintained and used for community activities.
Paramaribo's population includes a large percentage of South Asian and Indonesian descent, many of whom are Muslim. The eastern interior is home to various indigenous tribes, like the Arawak, Carib, and Wayana. The Arawak, in particular, have extensive documentation in media and children's literature. Their traditional oral literature includes legends, cosmology, and epic tales.
Paramaribo has successfully preserved its colonial architecture, adding to the cultural landscape. Cultural events include film festivals, musical performances, and the ceremonial year in November. Traditional festivals mark national holidays for different ethnic groups, and artists adapt folk culture into modern forms.
Specific festivals mentioned in your sources include Holi, the Carnival of Mwengo, festivals celebrating the arrival of Chinese immigrants, various spiritual festivals, and the annual Pagara Festival in the capital, described as vital to the city's atmosphere with its food stalls. Traditional fairs are also held in towns like Mongo and Elbina, with the largest in Paramaribo.
These festivals are rooted in rituals or religion and vary in length. Your sources note that the most impressive ones often involve sacrifices. They serve to encourage local pride and transmit culture to younger generations. The Amak festival is described as Islamic Creole, commemorating the deceased, and Kodi is the local New Year celebration.
This linguistic variety is highlighted as a distinctive facet of Suriname. Dutch is the official language used across institutions and is widespread in urban areas.
However, Surinamese Dutch has its own unique characteristics, influenced by Indian and African roots, and incorporates many Amerindian words that have even entered the standard Dutch language, such as kawina, igarape, and cacao. Words of African origin include wither, doku, and bisi.
Your sources point out a fascinating detail. The verb ending t in standard Dutch actually stems from the Surinamese language, although it's often marked as a grammatical error in Suriname, Netherlands. The sources are clear in debunking the misconception that Surinamese Dutch is merely non-standard, stating it's a language in its own right with unique syntactic, phonological, and morphological features.
Suriname, a distinct Creole language, is also prominent, with Afro-Surinamese as its main speakers. The Khoi, indigenous inhabitants of the marshes, are distinguished by their language, which is also of Afro-Surinamese origin but has a different structure from Suriname. Suriname grammar is noted as less precise than English or Dutch.
Historically, Suriname served as Suriname's most international language of commerce and transport before the rise of tourism. The sources describe it as the richest of the languages spoken in the remote interior, including dialects like Kaiser, Okuhines, Holo, and Saramaka.
After abolition in 1863, the formerly enslaved populations were recruited for agricultural labor and later for industrial jobs. Many moved from the countryside to Paramaribo, bringing with them their different languages.
Plantation Java language, based on Indonesian Malay, is also considered a Surinamese language by your sources, containing legal phrases that Dutch administrators couldn't understand. It's described as resembling Malay spoken in Java, similar to how Holo relates to Creole.
From culture to the environment, your sources describe Suriname's incredible natural wealth, rich flora and fauna, extensive nature parks, and river systems offering opportunities for adventure in relatively untouched nature.
Plantations like coffee, cocoa, and coconut offer tours, particularly in the summer. Your sources emphasize that Suriname possesses almost unspoiled ecosystems. It's also highlighted as the only country where a historic city, Paramaribo, is recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site for its colonial architecture.
The country has 15 protected areas and 13 nature reserves. The largest and most significant is the Central Suriname Nature Reserve, which is itself a UNESCO World Heritage Site.
This reserve spans a massive 1.6 million hectares, encompassing rainforests, savanna, and rivers. It's one of the largest protected areas in the tropics, safeguarding pristine tropical forests, including those on bauxite deposits.
The biodiversity is staggering, with abundant plant, bird, and animal species. Your sources mention iconic examples like jaguars, tapirs, the striking cock of the rock bird, and the brightly colored poison frog. The reserve also features rapids, with the one at Voltsburg being particularly famous.
Moving west, Kabalebo is a reservoir region with facilities for recreation and relaxation, including accommodation and activities like swimming, hiking, fishing, canoeing, and mountain biking. Excursions to bush lodges or day trips by boat to an eco-resort are also possible.
Further west, at the mouth of the Marawin River, is Galabi, known for its brown beach. It offers charming accommodation and is famous as a breeding ground for 3 types of sea turtles. It's a popular spot for swimming, fishing, and walks, noted for its cheerful atmosphere, especially during full moon celebrations.
Along the southern border with Brazil and French Guiana lie the Tumucumac Mountains, a range reaching up to 1,000 meters. Your sources identify this region as a rich biodiversity hotspot.
Interestingly, the infrastructure originally built for gold and bauxite mining in this remote area now paradoxically provides access for eco and adventure trips to this virtually uninhabited region.
It's described as the only mountain region in Suriname, with extensive savannas and unique geographical features called buttes, which host enormous biodiversity in flora and fauna. Pascu, or Pyramid Mountain, noted as the highest in Suriname, is particularly known for a variety of unusual and endemic pitcher plants.
Your sources highlight the Kaitur waterfall as a major natural highlight, claiming it's 5 times higher than Niagara Falls. It's described as a spectacular sight due to its sheer water volume and the rainbow colors often visible, offering experiences from boats below or views from above, with nearby hikes showcasing the biodiversity.
While the natural beauty is immense, your sources also address the significant environmental issues facing Suriname. Rapid agricultural expansion, both during colonial times and post-colonial, has led to a homogenization of ecosystems like forests, savannas, and wetlands, threatening natural diversity.
Hydraulic gold mining, which intensified from the early 1990s, along with traditional logging, overfishing, industrial agriculture, and energy development projects, continue to impact both biodiversity and the sociocultural fabric of traditional maroon communities who rely on these environments.
A key challenge highlighted is the government's severely limited capacity to mitigate these threats. This is attributed to decrepit infrastructure and deficiencies in human, physical, and financial capital.
This stands in stark contrast to the recognition of the Guiana Shield reserves in Suriname as a globally important biodiversity hotspot. The easily accessible, intact rainforest is seen as absolutely critical for sustainable development.
Suriname is characterized as a small, megadiverse tropical country with an astonishing 93% pristine rainforest cover, which our sources note as a world record in terms of global coverage. 20% of the land is wetlands, including the largest inland freshwater lake and the largest expanse of unique white sand and toxics in the Guiana Shield, forming hydrological hotspots with rare ecosystems and endemic species.
However, despite this wealth, biodiversity is under increasing pressure from emerging developments. Primarily gold mining, extensive agriculture, bush and forest fires, infrastructure expansion, overfishing, and poaching. The Amazon rainforest, which extends into Suriname, is described as a hotspot of both biodiversity and extinction, facing threats from climate change, deforestation, and road corridor development.
Your sources delve into the factors driving deforestation, analyzing data and policies related to sustainable agriculture. Suriname is presented as an interesting case study highlighting the tension between land competition for development and the need for environmental protection.
The country's tropical climate and vast forest cover contrast with historically low deforestation rates. Your sources attribute these low rates to several factors: a relatively low population concentrated on the coast, the colonial history keeping plantations near ports, a lack of infrastructure limiting access to the interior, and the historical presence of maroons, which acted as a deterrent to unchecked expansion into forest areas due to the risk of attack.
Strict government control and regulations on logging concessions also contributed to lower historical rates. However, emerging threats today include the expansion of plantations like palm oil and sugarcane, as well as small and medium-scale mining operations.
International companies are expressing interest in reviving the palm oil industry. Palm oil and sugarcane for ethanol production are identified as potentially the biggest areas of agricultural expansion. Recent data cited shows the government considering and signing agreements for new palm oil production on a substantial 90,000 hectares.
Your sources note that previous palm oil production cycles did lead to deforestation. Regarding biodiversity conservation efforts, a complete natural history of the plant and animal life in Suriname is still lacking.
While explorations and collections date back to the 17th century, finding missing groups in museum collections is described as a monumental task. Partial checklists exist, but none are considered complete or fully satisfactory.
There's an ongoing effort to address this systematically. A 2-year intensive collection effort focusing on terrestrial mammals in 1982, the Suriname Small Mammal Survey revealed a rich fauna covering bats, insectivores, and rodents, and involved both local and foreign researchers.
This study, according to your sources, highlighted the specific challenges of studying mammals in a tropical rainforest environment. It also gathered a wealth of unpublished data, with the collection now housed in the Suriname's museum.
Based on this work, recommendations for the government included constructing a regional small mammal collection and facilitating collection expeditions supervised by Surinamese research institutions.
There's also a call for mutual interest between government agencies and private organizations to support the development of nature reserves like Amakuro and Wilhelm Day.
A more productive approach suggested is establishing sabbatical or work-study programs for young Surinamese staff biologists at recognized international institutions. This would provide crucial first-hand training in global biodiversity questions with minimal cost and help maintain international contacts. Your sources note that while research has been cooperative, a formal institutional framework for long-term collaboration is highly desirable but currently lacking.
Finally, let's look at Suriname's place on the international stage, as described in your sources. The country maintains a dynamic international relations agenda guided by its national interests and the approach of the current administration. This involves bilateral, regional, and multilateral cooperation.
Historically, Suriname has important ties based on migration patterns, good neighborliness, and sector-specific cooperation with countries across Europe, the Americas, Asia, and the Middle East.
Suriname is a member of numerous international organizations, including the UN, the Organization of American States, OAS, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, CILAGRAC, the Non-Aligned Movement, the UN Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, ACLAC, CARICOM, the Caribbean Community, The Union of South American Nations, UNASUR, the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, CDMA, the World Bank, the IMF, and is a founding country of the Caribbean Development Bank.
Development partnerships are pursued with countries in the Americas, Asia, and Europe, prioritizing assistance that aligns with national interests. Border issues are a significant area of focus. The maritime border with French Guiana was legally defined in 2016 based on an international ruling.
Negotiations are ongoing for the inland border with Brazil, which is confirmed by existing treaties. Discussions are also underway to establish basic principles for a border agreement with Guyana.
There's considerable focus on cooperation with Brazil and Guyana, specifically on border management, security, and environmental protection, aiming to strengthen overall cooperation within the South American region.
Concerted action is also taking place in agricultural production, particularly for rice, sugar, and bananas, to strengthen Suriname's position in Caribbean production. Within CARICOM, cooperation centers on trade, development assistance, protecting maritime zones, and regional security.
Your sources note growing interest in bilateral and multilateral cooperation with countries in Asia and the Middle East. The emerging hydrocarbon sector is also escalating international interests, presenting both opportunities and challenges that require long-term investment and involvement in international and national planning bodies.
Regional cooperation has been a long-standing effort. Post-independence in 1975, Suriname joined CARICOM with goals of economic integration, regional cooperation in areas like education and health, and trade promotion. Membership in CARICOM is generally viewed in your sources as a success, providing opportunities for trade, investment, and jobs.
Suriname also joined the Association of Caribbean States, ACS, which provides a forum for dialogue and cooperation on issues like trade, tourism, and natural disasters.
In recent years, Suriname has sought to strengthen ties with the wider Caribbean region, especially for tourism development. Membership in the Caribbean Tourism Organization in 2002 is seen as a belated but welcome step.
The main goal of joining UNASUR in 2008 was to enhance regional political cooperation, intending to address issues like foreign and defense policy coordination, combating crime and drug trafficking, and regional efforts on poverty, education, and health. This was also motivated by the opportunity to build better relations with regional powerhouses like Brazil and Venezuela.
Looking at global partnerships, post-independent Suriname established diplomatic relations with over 93 countries and joined numerous international organizations. Multilateral diplomacy was a priority, although initial attempts at full lobbying were unsuccessful, and Suriname was initially viewed by some as a pariah state.
The return to civilian rule in the late 1980s led to renewed interest in engaging with multilateral forums. In August 1988, Suriname established diplomatic relations with the United States, which had been suspended since the 1980 coup.
Suriname was also among the first countries to reestablish relations with Brazil after a decade-long break. Other partners include its immediate neighbors and various international bodies. The relationship with the OAS became particularly important for addressing issues like arms trafficking.
Suriname sought to integrate further into global governance by joining the UN and its specialized agencies and participating in UN peacekeeping missions. More recent partnerships include engagement with the G77 and the G20 with the Global South, although your sources note that Suriname's capacity to actively participate in high-level multilateral forums remains limited.
Membership in the Commonwealth of Nations is highlighted as an important channel for development assistance. Suriname is also part of the African, Caribbean, and Pacific Group, ACP, in its engagement with the EU, providing a forum for Caribbean and South American concerns, particularly related to the Cotonou Agreement's development dimensions.
Finally, concerns regarding illegal drugs and arms trafficking have brought Suriname into closer contact and cooperation with various international organizations.
So, bringing this deep dive right up to contemporary Suriname, based on your sources, we see a country described as the smallest in South America, noted for its location and size.
The sources reiterate the major ethnic groups: Indigenous, East Indians, Creoles, Javanese, Chinese, Maroons, Europeans, and others, and the main religions: Christianity, Hinduism, and Islam.
Despite high hopes for prosperity after independence, your sources state the reality was different, marked by the military coup in the early 80s and a bloody civil war. A new government was reestablished in the 90s, but economic trajectories diverged.
While a broad-based economy was prioritized, liberalist measures seemed to primarily benefit a small group, according to your sources. Booming sectors like timber, sugar, bauxite products, and gold mining existed alongside industries like livestock and rice that were reportedly dismantled.
The sources point to deteriorating climate conditions and socioeconomic factors. Suriname maintained a low international political profile during certain periods. A critical observation is that discussions on deforestation and climate change were delayed until, according to your sources, over a third of the forest was already lost, necessitating heavy regulations.
Few agreements were made, discussions were minimal, and clear visions or action plans were lacking on these environmental fronts. Regressing water infrastructure combined with increased rainfall exposed the country's vulnerability to floods.
A climate policy plan was drafted late, just before the Paris Accord, described in your sources as incomplete with anticipated emission reductions deemed too low and no hints of similar policies being developed.
The conclusion drawn in your sources is stark. Suriname is susceptible to these environmental and economic challenges. It lacks a clear national vision and a midterm plan to navigate vulnerable years, and there's a shortage of skilled professionals in the job market.
The reliability of national statistics is questioned, with your sources using the strong phrase, dementia-style guesses, to describe them.
While the government is reportedly aware of the urgency of these issues, your sources state that powerful lobbies, from big exporters, palm oil companies, and gold diggers, threaten efforts towards sustainable development and good governance.
World attention for Suriname is described as profoundly desired, with hopes that sufficient funds can support the country in achieving its 2030 development ambitions and implementing larger-scale programs.
Your sources conclude with a powerful statement about the past 25 years, from their publication date, asserting that trust hurts and unaccountable systems breed corruption.
Wow. This deep dive through your sources has taken us on quite a journey from ancient inhabitants and colonial conflicts, through the painful history of slavery and the struggle for independence, to the environmental treasures and challenges, the complex political landscape, and its place in the world today. Unpacking this material really shows the incredible resilience and the profound struggles woven into Suriname's history.
What stands out, looking at the whole picture presented in these sources, is this constant tension between immense natural potential, deep cultural roots, and the persistent challenges stemming from historical legacies, political instability, and external economic pressures. It underscores how interconnected all these facets are.
Absolutely. And given the wealth of natural resources described in your sources, the deep-seated ethnic diversity we explored, and the clear-eyed view the material provides of past struggles and powerful external and internal forces, it leaves you with a really important question.
This raises an important question for you to consider based on this material. How can Suriname truly harness its potential and navigate the complex forces detailed in these sources, the economic pressures, the political instability, the environmental threats, the legacies of colonialism and conflict, to build a more stable and prosperous future for all its people?
A lot to think about. We hope this deep dive into your sources has been valuable for you.